The scene opens in near total darkness. The camera glides slowly across a stone chamber, its walls damp with centuries of moisture. A faint, flickering torch casts restless shadows that crawl across the jagged surface. In the center of the room, something metallic catches the light, a cruel shape, angular, sharp, and unnatural. As the torch draws closer, its full horror emerges. A chair that is not a chair, but a weapon disguised as furniture. Its pointed, pyramid-like tip gleams with a cold, merciless shine. This is not a place of comfort. It is a throne of agony. The narrator's voice enters, low, steady, and haunting. Throughout the history of mankind, there have been tools of pain created not merely to punish, not merely to silence, but to extend suffering to its very limits. Not swift, not merciful, not final, but slow, deliberate, endless. Tools that turned flesh into torn fragments, that turned the body into its own executioner, collapsing under its own weight. Among them, one name echoes with particular dread. The Judas chair, the Judas Cradle. A creation born in the shadows of the Middle Ages, an invention so cruel it was said to test not only the body, but the very soul of its victims. The torchlight lingers on the sharp peak of the chair, the camera circling around it, as if reluctant to get too close. Every angle of its design seems calculated for torment, a geometric point that promises no escape, no reprieve, no dignity. This was no ordinary device of torture. The Judas chair was a masterpiece of suffering, a grim tool employed not to kill swiftly, but to keep a person alive, screaming, breaking, and unraveling piece by piece. Imagine being suspended above this sharp, unyielding tip, lowered slowly, so slowly that the body's own weight became the instrument of its destruction. Every second an eternity, every inch a betrayal of the flesh. And it was betrayal, after all, that gave this creation its name. The name Judas, the biblical figure synonymous with treachery, with betrayal for silver and power, was not chosen by accident. To be placed upon the Judas chair was to be forced into a state of shame, humiliation, and the most excruciating pain imaginable. The victims were not only broken physically, they were meant to be broken spiritually, stripped of hope as their bodies yielded inch by inch to the merciless device. The torchlight wavers, and the stone walls seem to close in. The sound of dripping water echoes faintly in the background, each drop a reminder of time dragging endlessly forward. The camera pulls back, showing the chair alone in the chamber, bathed in half-light, like an idol to suffering. In the dungeons of medieval Europe, where justice was often twisted into cruelty, the Judas chair became more than just a tool of interrogation. It was a message, a declaration of power, a symbol that the authorities did not seek truth, they sought domination. And they found it, not with swords or armies, but with devices like this. Devices that prolonged agony so long the victim might beg for death, yet death would not come easily. The screen fades slowly to black, but the voice lingers one final time. The Judas chair, a seat no one dared to sit upon, a reminder that in the darkest corners of history, humanity's imagination was not used to create beauty, but to perfect suffering. The Middle Ages in Europe were not only an age of castles, cathedrals, and crusades. They were also an era steeped in superstition, fear, and an unforgiving grip of authority. Faith and power walked hand in hand, and where doubt arose, terror was often the cure. It was in this climate that the Inquisition emerged, a judicial arm of the Church whose stated mission was to root out heresy and purify the faithful. But behind the noble language of salvation Darker tools waited in the shadows. Tools like the Judas chair. The very first whispers of such a device are thought to have circulated in medieval Spain and Italy during the height of the Inquisition in the 14th and 15th centuries. These were the centuries when dissent, whether theological, philosophical, or simply political, was not met with debate, but with interrogation. And interrogation was rarely gentle. Heretics, witches, and accused traitors were brought into stone chambers where faith was tested not by words, but by flesh torn apart under iron and fire. The Judas chair was crafted precisely for this purpose, not to kill immediately, but to exhaust, to humiliate, to degrade. In the philosophy of the Inquisitors, pain itself was cleansing. The suffering of the body was seen as a kind of purification of the soul. Yet this language, cloaked in theology, served only as a veil for what was, in truth, systematic barbarity. The design of humiliation. Unlike other tools of torture, racks, iron maidens, or wheels, the Judas chair carried an almost surgical precision in its cruelty. Its structure was deceptively simple, a tall, pyramidal seat with a sharp, conical tip. Victims would be stripped, bound, and suspended above it, then lowered gradually onto the point. The body's own weight became the executioner, pressing down mercilessly. The longer the victim remained, the deeper the wound, and the more unbearable the agony. What set the Judas chair apart was its design to prolong, not end life. A victim could be kept upon the seat for hours, even days, depending on the whim of the torturer. Guards might raise them slightly to keep them from collapsing entirely, only to lower them again. The torment was not a sudden explosion of pain, but a drawn-out descent into despair. And then there was the humiliation. Unlike other forms of execution or combat, the Judas chair targeted not the chest, not the limbs, but the most vulnerable parts of the body. This was no accident. By forcing victims into positions of total exposure, the device stripped away not only dignity, but humanity. To be placed upon the Judas chair was not simply to be tortured, it was to be shamed. The name of betrayal. Why call it the Judas chair? The answer lies in the symbolism of betrayal. Judas Iscariot, in the Christian tradition, was the apostle who betrayed Christ for 30 pieces of silver. His name became synonymous with treachery, with dishonor, with the lowest depths of human behavior. To christen this torture device with his name was no coincidence. Victims of the Judas chair were often accused of betraying the church, betraying their community, or betraying the faith itself. To place them on this device was to say, "You are Judas, and your punishment is the same shame he brought upon himself." But there is another layer of irony. Judas's betrayal was one moment of weakness. The Judas chair inflicted betrayal upon the body itself. The victim's flesh, weight, and gravity became their own enemy. They were condemned to feel their very being turning against them, inch by inch, as if their body had betrayed their soul. Historical context. Fear and control. The Inquisition did not invent cruelty, but it codified it. In the name of doctrine, it made suffering a system. And the Judas chair was part of this machinery of fear. The medieval church, facing waves of heretical movements like the Cathars or dissenters like the Waldensians, needed a spectacle of power. Executions burned heretics in public squares, but torture chambers broke them in secret, behind thick walls where cries echoed but never escaped. Devices like the Judas chair
were not about extracting truth. Confessions obtained under such torment were notoriously unreliable. Instead, they were about reinforcing obedience. The mere rumor of such a device was enough to silence many before they ever dared speak. To know that one could be stripped naked and subjected to days of drawn-out torment on the Judas chair was to know that rebellion carried unimaginable consequences. Shadows of doubt. And yet, historical records of the Judas chair remain strangely elusive. Unlike the rack or the gallows, the Judas chair is not extensively documented in official archives. Some historians argue it may have been exaggerated in later centuries as part of a Gothic fascination with the Dark Ages. Others suggest it existed in different variations, spreading across Europe, each region adding its own details to the horror. Whether fully real, exaggerated, or partly imagined, its symbolism endured. The Judas chair came to embody everything people feared about medieval justice: the merging of faith and cruelty, of betrayal and humiliation, of pain dressed in the language of purity.
The chamber is cold, the air thick with the stench of damp stone and smoke from half-burnt torches. In the center, under the flickering light, stands the Judas chair. At first glance, it seems almost deceptively plain, a wooden or metal frame, tall and angular. But at its heart is a cone-shaped spike, gleaming faintly, its polished tip waiting like a silent predator. This was no ordinary seat, it was a throne of agony. The construction. The Judas chair was built in several variations, but the principle remained the same. Imagine a pyramid carved into a perfect sharp point. This point rose from a sturdy base, often made of oak or reinforced with iron. Some versions stood no higher than a stool, others were elevated on tall legs so the victim could be suspended above and lowered with ropes. The surface of the cone could be smooth, forcing the skin to tear with the pressure of weight alone, but in some accounts, iron ridges or barbs were added, so that once the body sank upon it, there was no escape, only further shredding if the victim struggled. To the casual eye, it might look like a crude carpenter's project, but the design was intentional. Its geometry ensured that the full burden of the victim's own body weight was focused onto one excruciating point: the method of torture. The ritual was as cruel as the device itself. The victim, often stripped naked to maximize humiliation, would be bound at the wrists and ankles. They were hoisted above the cone by ropes, their legs forced apart in helpless suspension, and then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, they were lowered. The point was deliberately aligned with the most vulnerable parts of the body, the anus or genitals. The descent was rarely sudden. Instead, the torturer controlled the ropes inch by inch, ensuring that pain was not a strike of lightning, but a slow burn. The first contact would already send shock waves of agony through the victim's body, but the true horror began as gravity did its work. Bit by bit, their own weight drove them deeper. The cone pressed harder, tearing flesh, spreading tissue. And the more the victim struggled, the worse the wounds became. In some accounts, guards would halt the descent, leaving the victim poised, half-impaled for hours. The ropes would then be loosened again, and the body would slide deeper. This stop-start rhythm of pain was designed to shatter the spirit as much as the flesh, enhancing the torment. As if the device itself were not enough, variations of the Judas chair introduced further refinements. Sometimes weights were tied to the victim's legs, pulling them down faster, ensuring a deeper tear. At other times, lubricants were smeared onto the cone, but not to ease the pain. Substances like animal fat or rancid oils were applied, specifically because they would rot, infect, and poison the wounds. The result was a drawn-out death, not a swift execution, but a grotesque performance of suffering.
Victims might not die immediately. Instead, they lingered, bleeding, delirious, begging. Days could pass. Some accounts speak of victims surviving nearly a week, their bodies slowly collapsing upon themselves until infection and exhaustion claimed them. A theater of pain. The Judas chair was rarely a private punishment. Like many medieval tortures, it served as theater, a spectacle meant to instill terror in onlookers. Picture it, a stone chamber filled with the echo of screams, inquisitors in their robes standing silent, guards tightening ropes, priests murmuring prayers. For the victim, it was the collapse of all dignity. For those watching, it was a warning carved into flesh. This is what happens when you betray the faith, when you defy authority. The cruelty was not simply physical, it was psychological. The victim was forced to confront the inevitability of their own destruction, to feel each moment stretched into eternity. Even those who survived, rare though they were, would be permanently scarred, crippled, humiliated.
The prolonged death. What made the Judas chair infamous was not the intensity of its pain, but its duration. Most torture devices kill quickly: the axe, the gallows, the guillotine. The Judas chair, however, killed by inches. As the hours became days, the wounds grew infected, fever set in, blood loss weakened the body, organs began to fail. The victim would often drift in and out of consciousness, only to awaken again in pain. This cycle of torment could continue until their body could endure no more. In some cases, executioners never intended the victim to die immediately at all. Instead, the device served as a tool of interrogation. The sight of someone perched in agony upon the Judas chair could break the will of others far faster than whips or flames. The message was clear: speak, confess, obey, or this will be your fate. The philosophy of prolonged agony. The Judas chair was not designed by accident. It was the product of a worldview where pain was a weapon of control, where torment was justified as purification, and where human bodies were reduced to instruments of fear. Unlike devices that ended life with brutal swiftness, this chair turned life itself into the punishment. Each breath, each second was another cut, another humiliation. Death was not the goal, suffering was. Narrator's closing note. The camera lingers on the dark silhouette of the Judas chair, its point glinting under torchlight. A voice whispers, "It was not just wood and metal. It was a philosophy carved into flesh, a belief that true power lies not in how fast you can end a life, but in how long you can hold it captive." The Judas chair was not about execution. It was about erasing the very idea of hope.
In the cold stone dungeon, the sound of chains dragging across the floor echoed like a death sentence. The damp walls did not need eyes to remember. They had absorbed thousands of screams over the centuries. And there, in the center of the darkness, the Judas chair stood silently, like a mute judge waiting for its next victim. Who were the ones forced to sit upon it? Not only those accused of heresy, the ones who dared to question the church. Not only rebels accused of treason against the crown. Sometimes it was the innocent, people destroyed by a whisper of accusation, by envy, or simply to satisfy the cruelty of those in power. In medieval Europe, a vague suspicion was enough to drag someone into a dungeon. A woman envied by her neighbors, accused of being a witch, could find herself bound to the Judas chair the very next night. A farmer who refused to pay his taxes, a craftsman who dared mock the clergy, each could be branded a traitor and condemned to the chair. And so they were led away, not to a bright execution ground, but into a chamber where there was no tomorrow. The screams in the dungeon. Picture the scene. The prisoners suspended by ropes, eyes wide in terror, as they stared at the sharp pyramid below. On the walls, the shadows of guards flickered in torchlight. The room was silent, except for the victim's ragged breath. Then came the creak of rope as the descent began. The moment flesh touched the tip, a scream ripped through the dungeon. Not the sharp cry of a sword strike, not the short gasp of a wound, but a howl drawn out, a howl of pain without end. Some called upon God, begging for forgiveness. Some broke into sobbing whispers. Others, in desperation, bit their own tongues in an attempt at suicide, but guards would shove rags into their mouths, forcing them to stay alive, to suffer longer. No one answered those prayers. The dungeon swallowed every sound and returned only echoes, colder than any sentence of death. A death that must not come quickly. To be beheaded meant a moment's pain. To be hanged meant a few minutes of choking. But with the Judas chair, death was a slow march. The body tore little by little. Blood did not gush to grant a swift end. It dripped, soaking into the stones below. The pain never left. It only changed its mask, burning, then numbing, then rotting. Infection was the most merciless executioner. Filth and rancid oils were smeared deliberately on the chair to ensure wounds festered. Victims burned with fever, shivering and delirium. Their limbs went numb, but the core of their bodies burned like fire. Death did not come as release. It came slowly, cruelly, sometimes after days. Tales tell of victims surviving on the Judas chair for 4, even 5 days before their hearts finally gave out. The tragedy of hopelessness. What made the chair so terrifying was not only the physical pain, but the absolute hopelessness. The victims knew there was no escape. They knew every passing minute only dragged them deeper into hell. And worst of all, they knew that death was not allowed to come swiftly. Some confessed to crimes they never committed, hoping for a quicker end. But the torturers often denied them even that mercy. A confession might simply prolong the torment, a cruel game for those in power. For the falsely accused, the tragedy was doubled. They screamed their innocence, cried out that they were no heretics, no traitors. But in that chamber, there was no truth, only the sharp steel of the chair. A mournful ending. The blood dried. The screams fell silent, yet the chair remained, motionless, pitiless. It knew no compassion, no rest. It only waited. The narrator's voice drops into the shadows, heavy as a verdict. The victims of the Judas chair did not just lose their lives. They lost their dignity, their voices, their right even to die as human beings. This was not a quick death, because a quick death was too merciful. The chair taught them a final, brutal lesson. In the Middle Ages, even the right to die was not yours to choose.
The Judas chair lingers in history like a shadow that will not fade. It is not just a device of torture, it has become a symbol, a haunting reminder of what happens when cruelty is systematized, when pain itself becomes a form of governance. A symbol of systematic cruelty. Historians who study the Middle Ages often describe the Judas chair not merely as a tool, but as a reflection of the age. This was not random violence, not a passing outburst of brutality. It was institutionalized. The very existence of the Judas chair shows how deeply the logic of torture was woven into medieval justice. It was not enough to punish the body with chains or to silence the voice with execution. No, The goal was to prolong agony, to break both flesh and spirit, to make pain itself the lesson. The Inquisition, in particular, viewed suffering as a form of purification. To them, agony was not only a punishment, it was a ritual cleansing of the soul. The Judas chair embodied that twisted philosophy. Sitting upon its sharp steel was, in their eyes, a way of burning out sin. Yet, even in their records, there is a silence that chills. Very few official documents describe the chair in detail. Instead, it survives in whispers, sketches, and the words of later chroniclers. Was it real or exaggerated? Here lies the great debate. Some scholars argue that the Judas chair was not as widely used as legend suggests. Perhaps it was reserved for only the worst criminals, or perhaps its horrors grew in the retelling, magnified into myth by centuries of fear. Skeptics point out that the lack of extensive medieval documentation leaves room for doubt. Was the Judas chair a common instrument of torture across Europe? Or was it a dark tale, retold and reshaped until it became larger than life? But even if the Judas chair itself was not everywhere, the spirit of it undeniably was. Other devices from the same era confirm the mindset. The rack, tearing limbs apart. The Iron Maiden, a coffin of spikes. The breaking wheel, reducing a human body to shattered bones. Whether or not the Judas chair stood in every dungeon, the principle it represents, slow, deliberate, merciless torment, was very real. And so, the chair's legend has lived on because it embodies an age where fear was policy and cruelty was law. Entering literature and art. Over the centuries, the Judas chair escaped the dungeon walls and entered the human imagination. In old engravings and medieval woodcuts, one can find depictions of sharp pyramids with bound victims hovering above them. Later writers described it in lurid detail. Their words meant both to horrify and to moralize. Pain became spectacle, retold in books as cautionary tales of human darkness. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the chair had become part of the Gothic imagination. Illustrators painted its shape into scenes of torture chambers. Historians of crime and punishment referenced it alongside other infamous devices, cementing its place in the gallery of mankind's cruelties. Even in modern culture, the Judas chair surfaces, appearing in horror novels, dark museums, documentaries, and online forums where the morbid curiosity of the human mind returns again and again to the question, how could humans invent such a thing? A haunting legacy. The Judas chair is not just remembered as an object, it is remembered as a warning. It forces us to look at how power can twist morality, how religion, law, and authority, when consumed by fear, can create tools not of justice, but of despair. The chair is more than wood and steel. It is an emblem of the dangers of unchecked cruelty.
The shadow that will not fade. Perhaps the greatest horror of the Judas chair is not that it existed, but that it still haunts us. It raises questions we cannot easily answer. Did human beings truly lower others onto that sharp point, inch by inch, until days of torment drained the last breath? Or has legend exaggerated the cruelty, turning whispers into nightmares? But whether or not the historical details are exact, the symbolism remains undeniable. The Judas chair stands as an archetype of cruelty, the embodiment of slow suffering, of deliberate humiliation, of torture elevated to an art. And in this way, the chair has achieved a kind of immortality, not as an artifact of wood and steel, but as a shadow in history's memory.
Its image is carved not just into books and museums, but into the collective imagination of humanity. It appears in the corners of nightmares, in the unsettling fascination that draws us back to the darkest inventions of our past. Because the Judas chair is more than a chair. It is a mirror. And when we look at it, we see not only medieval torturers, but ourselves, and the lengths to which human cruelty can go when fear and power walk hand in hand. The narrator's voice lowers, heavy, grave. Whether it was used often or only whispered in fear, the Judas chair became legend because it captured the very soul of medieval torment. It is history's reminder that cruelty, once given purpose, becomes more enduring than steel. And so the chair remains, not in the dungeons of stone, but in the dark corridors of memory.
The Judas chair has outlived its age of iron and stone. Centuries have passed since the dungeons of medieval Europe fell silent, yet the chair itself still lingers, not in shadows, but in memory, museums, and imagination. The Museum of Horror. Today, across Europe, replicas of the Judas chair are displayed in museums of torture. Behind glass, beneath dim lights, they sit waiting, sharp, alien, monstrous in their simplicity. Tourists wander past them with wide eyes. Some lean closer, whispering in disbelief. Others step back, their faces pale, their bodies recoiling as if the chair could still cut them. To stand before the Judas chair is to feel history breathing down your neck. You imagine the screams that once might have filled the stones around it. You imagine the trembling of a prisoner lowered inch by inch. Even when you remind yourself, this is just wood, just steel, the fear does not fade. That is the power of symbols, objects that carry echoes louder than any words. Fascination and fear. Visitors leave such museums with mixed emotions. Some scoff, convinced that the chair was exaggerated by legend. Some cannot look away, mesmerized by its sheer brutality. And many walk away shaken, haunted not by what the chair did, but by what it means. Why do we keep coming back to such relics? Why do books, films, and dark exhibitions continue to resurrect the Judas chair? Because it is more than a medieval device. It is a mirror. The Judas chair shows us what humanity is capable of when cruelty is justified, sanctified, and turned into policy. It reminds us that torture was never just about pain. It was about power. The chair embodies the most terrifying lesson of all, that suffering, once rationalized, can be engineered into something systematic, efficient, and deliberate. A reflection of human darkness. In the silence of the museum, as you stare at its sharp tip, you realize the Judas chair is not just about the Middle Ages. It is about us. About how cruelty does not vanish with time, but evolves, reshapes itself, hides in new forms. The chair forces a chilling question. How different are we, really? If one era could create a device designed to prolong agony for days, could another not invent its own? If the Middle Ages had their Judas chair, what symbols of cruelty will our time leave behind for future generations? This is why the chair endures, not as a medieval curiosity, but as a warning,
etched into wood and steel. Between horror and lesson. And yet there is also something strangely theatrical about the Judas chair's survival. Its shape has been drawn in books, recreated in films, even glamorized in horror entertainment. In this way, the chair has become both a cautionary tale and a spectacle, a paradox of fear and fascination. But perhaps that is part of its power. Just as medieval torturers used it to command obedience through fear, modern society uses it to remind us of the price of unchecked power. Its presence in museums is not only to horrify tourists, it is to ensure that the memory of cruelty is never erased. To stand before the Judas chair is to face the truth of human history without filter or denial. It is a brutal, unflinching testimony that reminds us of the darkest possibilities of the human mind. The final question. The narrator's voice lowers, heavy, almost whispering. Was the Judas chair truly used as often as legend says? Or has its horror grown with every telling, every drawing, every whisper in the dark? We may never know, but perhaps that is not the point. For what lingers today is not only the chair itself, but the thought behind it. The camera lingers on the sharp pyramid of the chair, glowing faintly under museum light. Silence fills the frame. Which is more terrifying, the narrator asks, the instrument of torture or the human mind that invented it? The image fades to black, leaving only the echo of that question, a question that refuses to be answered.
The torch sputters. Its flame dances weakly, shrinking with every breath of cold air in the stone chamber. Shadows stretch long across the dungeon walls, swallowing everything in darkness. And there, in the final flicker of light, the Judas chair stands, silent, immovable, a relic of cruelty. The camera lingers. We see the jagged tip of the chair gleam for one last moment, and then vanish as the flame dies out. The narrator's voice cuts through the silence, deep and resonant. The Judas chair, a seat no one would ever choose, a throne not of power but of agony. It is an invention that defies comprehension, a device not meant to kill quickly, but to stretch suffering until every scream is wrung from the human soul. It is more than a chair. It is a stain carved into history. A pause. Only the faint echo of dripping water in the dungeon remains. It reminds us of a truth we often fear to face, that pain is not only physical. Pain can linger in the mind, in the soul, in the imagination. To know of the Judas chair is to carry its shadow with you, to imagine its cold wood, its sharp steel, its terrible silence between screams. And that, too, is torture. The screen shifts. We see a ghostly recreation of the chair in use, blurred figures, indistinct, more suggestion than detail. The outline of a prisoner lowered slowly. Chains creak. A muffled cry breaks the silence. The camera does not linger on gore, only on fear. Within the medieval dungeons, suffering was not an accident of cruelty. It was the system, a system that justified torment as justice, that sanctified agony as purification. The Judas chair is not merely a relic of wood and iron. It is a reflection of how far humanity can sink when cruelty is cloaked in righteousness. The shot widens. We leave the dungeon. We pass through dark tunnels. The air grows colder, emptier, and then silence. The world above is bright, alive, modern, but beneath, in memory, the chair still waits. The narrator lowers his voice, almost to a whisper. Perhaps the screams have faded. Perhaps the walls no longer echo with pain, but in the imagination, in the soul of those who dare to remember, the Judas chair still speaks. Its silence is louder than any cry. It tells us what we are capable of. It tells us what we must never allow to return. The camera turns back one final time. A slow, cinematic close-up of the Judas chair as it disappears into shadow, swallowed by darkness. History is not just written in ink and parchment. It is written in blood, in iron, in screams, and sometimes in the shape of a chair. The torch finally dies. Blackness fills the screen. Only the sound remains, a faint clinking of chains, dragging slowly, fading into nothing. The narrator's last words echo into the silence. The Judas chair, a seat no one would ever choose, a throne not of power but of agony. In the darkness of the medieval dungeon, perhaps the screams still linger.